All right. Hello, everyone. I am Jessica Ann Mitchell Aiwuyor, founder of the National Black Cultural Information Trust. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for our first ever panel discussion with the Reparation Information Thought Series, co-hosted by the Reparation Education Project and the National Black Cultural Information Trust. The Reparation Information Thought Series is a periodic strategic webinar featuring reparations experts, racial justice, thought leaders, and you, engaged in critical discussion, reflection, and analysis on issues pertinent to the movement for reparatory justice in the United States and abroad. Tonight, we are discussing the weaponization of race in reparations and how to combat it. So now I'm going to hand it over to Nkechi Taifa, Director of the Reparation Education Project.
Thank you so very much, Jessica Ann Mitchell Aiwuyor, also known as JAM. I'm Nkechi Taifa, and I just want to encourage everyone to feel free to put your name and your organization and your city in the chat. I have the absolute pleasure to introduce our panelists for this evening. They're all very astute persons, and I'm proud to be associated with them. I want to first introduce my sister, Adjoa Aiyetoro. I was trying to say Professor Emeritus, of the William H. Bowen School of Law at the University of Arkansas. Adjoa Aiyetoro, we're talking about someone who has a long history in social justice issues. She had a career as a human rights attorney, as well as a social worker. She began her legal career as a staff attorney for the U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division Special Litigation Section, where she litigated cases involving the right of the institutionalized and developed an expertise in prisoner rights. She joined the ACLU National Prison Project in 1981, where she remained till 1992. And I am proud that that is where I met her, and she mentored me in the law during those years. Since 1992, she had served as executive director of the National Conference of Black Lawyers. She has been director of administration for the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. She has been a consultant for the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under the Law, organizing this 1995 delegation to the UN Beijing Conference on Women, and working with the preparatory meetings and the like for the World Conference Against Racism that was held in South Africa as the chief legal consultant for NCOBA, the National Coalition of Blacks Reparations in America. And she was a founding member of NCOBA at that 1987 meeting and served as its legal strategies director. In 2014, she received the Arkansas ACLU Civil Libertarian of the Year Award. She's done many writings on the issue of reparations over the years. And as I said from the beginning, she's now a professor emerita of the William H. Bowen School of Law at the University of Arkansas. And she really spearheaded their whole racial disparities in the Arkansas criminal justice system. So that was Adjoa Aiyetoro. I want to go next to introduce my brother and friend, Jeffery Robinson. We're talking about someone who is CEO and founder of the Who We Are Project, the organization that is the outgrowth of a talk Jeffery Robinson has been giving for over 10 years on the history of anti-Black racism and white supremacy in the U.S. This talk forms the basis of the feature-length documentary film currently running right now on
Netflix.
I didn't want to say the wrong one. And it formed the basis of the feature-length documentary, Who We Are, A Chronicle of Racism in America. Jeffery was an ACLU Deputy Legal Director and Director of the ACLU Trone Center for Justice and Equality, which housed the organization's work on criminal justice, racial justice, and reform issues. Since graduating from Harvard Law School in 1981, he represented indigent clients at the Defender Association and the Federal Public Defender's Office in Seattle. He had a 27-year in private practice in Seattle litigating over 200 criminal cases to verdict and more than a dozen civil cases representing plaintiffs suing corporate and government entities. He worked on behalf of one of the 5 men who were held at Guantanamo Bay. He is a past president of the Washington Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers and an elected fellow of the American College of Trial Lawyers. And I would like to, at this point, also introduce our panelists who will, hopefully she'll get here. It will be late because she's currently sitting as a commissioner on the California Reparations Task Force. I'm talking about Lisa Holder, and those hearings are going on right now as we speak. Lisa Holder is a nationally recognized award-winning trial attorney who has been identified as a, quote, super lawyer by Los Angeles Magazine for 4 consecutive years. She has dedicated her career in racial and social justice and systems change. She periodically teaches the Civil Rights and Police Accountability Clinic at UCLA Law School, serves as a legislative consultant on institutional bias elimination, drafting California's bias elimination laws, and testifying as a subject matter expert in the California Assembly and Senate. In 2019, she drafted laws that now require all judges, attorneys, court staff, and health professionals to undertake continuing education on bias elimination. In 2000, she co-steered the Proposition 16 campaign to repeal California's ban on affirmative action, and in 2001 was appointed by the governor to serve on the California Reparations Task Force. She is currently also the president of the Equal Justice Society in Oakland, California-based organization, transforming the nation's consciousness on race through law, social science, and the arts. And at this point, I want to also introduce our co-host, Jessica Ann Mitchell Aiwuyor, also known as JAM. She is a cultural communications expert, author, and publisher based in the Washington, D.C. area, founder of the National Black Cultural Information Trust. In her past role as the Associate Director of Communications at the National Fair Housing Alliance, she spearheaded strategic communications for federal housing discrimination lawsuits against Bank of America, Deutsche Bank, and Facebook. In addition to her work with national organizations and firms, JAM serves as communication chair for the Pan-African Congress North American Delegation. As an author and cultural storyteller, her writings about African-American cultural heritage and ethnicity have been published and cited across a wide range of publications, and she publishes books celebrating Black life and culture with her publishing company, Our Legacy Press. And I wanted to share those bios. I know they're lengthy. I know you can go on Google and get them, but I wanted to because of the importance of the topic that we are talking about today, the weaponization of race and reparations and how to combat it. We have some of the foremost thinkers, experts in this country on these issues, and we're glad to present them. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to JAM, Jessica Ann Mitchell Aiwuyor, who will give us just a basic interview, a brief overview of the current conversation surrounding how race is being used as a weapon in the context of reparations. And then we're going to turn it over to our panelists to hear from them. So welcome, everyone. And welcome, JAM. Take it away.
Thank you, Nkechi. So reparations and race. Reparations are heating up across the country. There are various reparations task forces and commissions being created in different cities and states. One of the biggest issues that reparations commissions and task forces are confronting is the issue of race. Now, obviously, race and racism play integral roles throughout chattel slavery and the vestiges of chattel slavery that affect our lives today. However, many reparations advocates fear directly addressing race as part of eligibility requirements or understanding the harmed community. Some believe that we must not use race in reparations initiatives because we may face legal challenges in the future for having race-based legislation. However, is it possible to truly have reparations If we can't talk about race and racism, can we truly have reparations if we must approach reparative justice from a race neutral perspective, even though nothing in our lives is race neutral? Today, we're joined by a panel of legal experts that will discuss this emerging theme in the reparations movement and whether or not we should be race neutral or include race as we focus on repairing the harms and also eligibility requirements.
So thank you so very much for that, Jam. And so Adjoa and Jeffrey, I want to invite you to share some of your initial thoughts on some of these themes that Jam threw out. You know, is it possible to talk about reparations without talking about race? Is it legal to have a race-based remedy? Is it really reparations if we can't really address the issue of race? What about issues involving race-based versus harm-based? Are we spinning in circles? Let's just hear some of your views. I don't know which one of you all wants to jump at the bit to start. I'll leave it to the two of you. Which one, Adjoa or Jeffrey?
No, Jeff, go on and you start.
There you go, Jeff.
Well,
take it away.
Thank you very much for including me in this panel. I think this is a really important question, and I'm gonna take the advice of Descartes in 1637 when he wrote the Discourse on Method. He said, if you have a really complicated problem, break it down into really small parts. And once you understand the small parts, the whole becomes very, very clear. And so, you know, if a person from our community was to shoot and kill someone and start running down the street, no one would say that the description should be, it's a man. Not going to say anything about race, so we don't know who we're looking for. People understand that at a very basic level. And so if we are trying to repair a harm, the first thing that you have to do is to identify the people who have been harmed. And the thing that you would want to do is to use the most accurate way to identify those people. And so I think what that says is the issue of race is very, very hard to walk away from. I think, and I'll echo this throughout the evening, one of the most important things in terms of trying to support legislation for reparation is the record, the factual record that you make. And that factual record should be focused on demonstrating that the best and most accurate description of the people who were harmed has to do with identifiers that we call race. And if you can do that in the record, you have a much better chance of then having the legislation supported, because it's not race-based, it's harm-based. If 10 people have houses on a street and 5 of the houses burn down, you don't want to give the money to the 5 people that didn't lose their house. And if the 5 people whose houses burned down, if they all happened to be Black, and you're trying to identify them, that is an accurate identification. That has nothing to do with racial prejudice or bias. That is simply an accurate identification of the group that was harmed. So I think that the record that goes into the legislation has to be really carefully thought out to support the legislation later on when there's a legal challenge. And so that's what I would just say to begin.
Well, I, of course, will start off thanking Nkechi and Jam for inviting me to be a part of this webinar. I think it's a very important question. And I think the title itself is a very important question, because I think it is a question. I agree with what Jeff has said. And my view is that you utilize the language that accurately describes the people who were injured, because reparations, as we all know, are payment to those who have been injured. And I define it by reparations being the payment of or repair of a people who were injured because of their group identity. And because of their group identity, African peoples, African descended peoples were injured significantly. And we can talk about how and all of that. But right now, and what those injuries are. And COBRA has 5 injury areas that they focus on, that we focus on. I do think that we have to utilize their approach, and I say their approach, to show how ridiculous their approach is. For example, Book Company, and they've since retracted it, so I will say that, in Florida, tried to tell the story of Rosa Parks without mentioning race. And so, as Jeffery said, you know, the woman got on the bus, sat in a seat, wouldn't move when asked to move to the back. And so she was arrested, and then a whole bunch of people decided they weren't going to take the bus anymore. So they were taking cars and walking to where their destination was. And, you know, I mean, the ridiculousness of the story. I mean, it doesn't tell the story. As Jeff pointed out, you've got to describe the people a little more. The second thing I want to say, if it's not inappropriate, and Nkechi or Jam, you stop me if I'm going to where you would rather me go later, is the weaponization of race is not new. Mm-hmm. The attack on us, because of this, and many of us know it's a social construction, but this race was created by them in the 15th century. The creation of the racial hierarchy, they created it. A white German man sat in his office, I'm assuming, I don't know where he sat, but he created it and it was adopted. And whites were at the top and blacks were at the bottom. So this creation of utilizing race to weaponize, I think it's a weapon, right? When they put you at the bottom, that's another weapon against you, because it says to everybody, these folk ain't as good as the rest of these people. See how they rank at the bottom. And it justified, there was a Southern physician, and I forget the state, it'll come to me maybe, and maybe it won't, that utilized this racial hierarchy to justify slavery, to justify it. So this is not new. So the newness of it is that they're flipping it. They created the oppression. They created the group that would be the most targeted for oppression. They created that hierarchy that says you can do what you want with them. You can kick them in the butt. You can do whatever. Okay, I don't know if I should say that on the webinar, but anyway. But now that this group is rising up with supporters, you see, not just the group itself, but with supporters, and demanding they do justice, they decide we no longer can use the very thing they created to allow us to get a remedy. So
let me ask you this. If either one or both of you can just backtrack just a bit and just explain a little bit more about what you talked about in terms of the race as a construct. Okay. Construction rate. Can you kind of elaborate a little bit?
Please, you start there and I'm going to come in afterwards, because I have heard you talk about this and I'm like ready for this. So please take off.
Okay.
Get your popcorn, because this is good.
So, and some people on here, I've seen some names, some people on here are going to do what I did when I first got introduced to this. I flipped out, right? I'm in a university setting and I'm the critical race theorist. I'm studying all of that. And they proffer that race is actually a social construct. Now, I flipped out. So those of you who have flipped out before or flipping out now, I was with you. But if you think about it, it is not, race is a construction. We are Africans, or we are African descendants. Somebody else is Chinese or Chinese descendant. That kind of thing, nationality. But they created race. And the studies can show, you how they did it. I started off with the 15th century. We have people like Higginbotham, Evelyn Higginbotham, and others who are scholars in this area, who have pulled together and articulated it from the study perspective. We think we learn on shows like, and I'm gonna show my hand on what shows I like CSI and those kind of shows. They say, oh, this is a Black person. They open it up and you can say this is a Black person. That's a falsity. We are more alike biologically than different. So I'm talking about the human race. So that's a falsity, to continue this lie of race. It is nationality based, and some people that I work with in the movement identify as African or African descendant. That is the appropriate and proper identification. So I'll shut up here and see where
Jeff,
you want to go with it, Jeff.
Well, and I just think it's very interesting, because if you take a look scientifically, other than the crazy eugenicists who believe in a master race, there is no legitimate science organization anywhere in the world that says that there is any difference between any of us. There are differences in nationality, there are differences in pigmentation and melanin, but there is no difference racially. There is the human race, one race, the human race. And the thing that I think is so interesting is that even though it is a construct, and even though scientifically we know it's a construct, look at how powerful it is. And that is what is important to understand, is that what we're talking about is not so much a reality. We're talking about people's view of the way the world is supposed to be. And you were saying earlier that one of the states in their secession statements were justifying slavery. I just want to read you a brief, this is not the worst thing in the Texas secession statement. They say that they are upset because the states against slavery are proclaiming the debasing doctrine of the equality of all men, irrespective of race or color, a doctrine at war with nature, in opposition to the experience of mankind, and in violation of the plainest revelations of the divine law. That is what you are dealing with, a culture that is based on that. And so the fact that this is a construct just shows you how people have taken that construct and used it to have an incredible impact on the culture that we live in. And that's why reparations are so important, and to understand it within that construct. And once you understand that race is a construct, and then you start identifying people by nationality, it's really clear, or it gets very clear. I'm not saying anything is easy, but it gets fairly clear who should have reparations, because you can identify the people who have been lumped into this category, not because of who they are, but because of what they look like. And that's the unfortunate or fortunate, however you want to look at it, nature of this. If you're trying to identify what people who are likely entitled to reparations look like, I'm just saying in general, look at 4 faces on this screen. There are a whole lot more different looks and shades and everything else, but we didn't use that as an identifier. America used that as an identifier. And when America chose to use our look, our nationality, our skin color as an identifier about who you're going to enslave, and after enslavement, who you're going to deny basic rights to, when America chose to use that as an identifier, they don't get to now come back and say, well, we use that as an identifier for who we were going to do it to, but you can't use it as an identifier for who gets reparations for what we did. That is insanity.
So
Can
before I
just-
go, yeah, Adjoa, actually, I'll go to you next, but I just want to make sure, Jam, feel free to jump in whenever you want. I'm gonna let Adjoa say what she wants to say, and I want to turn to the Supreme Court. But Adjoa, go on.
Yeah, I just want to say, and I hope, Jeff, you take this the right way. I learned years ago when I was working on the World Council Against Racism. We were going to various localities. We were in Uruguay, and the Uruguayans say that it is insulting to them and others in South America and, you know, all of the other Americas, that we use the term America as if somehow America is supreme. I have started using the United States. I know it's lengthier. I know it's not, doesn't roll off your tongue maybe the way America does, but America didn't do this. It was the United States.
You are absolutely right. I have 2 emails saying use United States, not America. So thank you for bringing that up. You are absolutely right.
Thank
I
you.
want to take it another step further if I can, because I never refer to, when we talk about the atrocities that the U.S. has committed and all like that, and a lot of people say we, it wasn't no we, like that song said, what you mean we, white man? I mean, it wasn't we. Okay, so I really, it's like natural in my mind, I disassociate. It wasn't we that enslaved us, and we're not part of the we. Isn't we that started the war in Vietnam? I mean, I'm just saying, you know, so I just want us to I make sure that we're conscious about that. Jam, did you want to jump in?
Sure. I just plus one that we weren't even citizens, you know, so it certainly wasn't we. But I think you were about to head in the direction of the question that I wanted to ask. So like, if we know all of these things about how race was weaponized against us, and we know now that folks are trying to prevent us from using the same standard that they used against us, what do we do now in terms of the law and the courts? So California people are concerned about Proposition 209. Nationally, people are concerned about what the Supreme Court may or may not think about reparations in terms of race. And so those are just my thoughts on what do you all think about that?
And as you all are thinking about what you think about that, concluded with, I want to hear about what Ketanji Brown Jackson is saying about that. But let's talk about what your thoughts are on the current state of the law.
I'll start, and I think, because I think Jeff has the quote from Ketanji Brown, if I'm not mistaken. So let me start. I think we have to fight it on at least 2 levels, if not more. One, I think the education that we are discussing now about the weaponization, whether we use that term or not, I'm just saying, we have to fight back by pulling down the shades or pulling up the shade, whatever that phrase is, and by exposing it as what it is, what we've just talked about. I don't need to repeat all of that. We have to do that through the skills like Jam has, journalism, you know, writing short pieces, putting it in places where people can see them, not just keeping them organizationally to ourselves, educating and encouraging those who are with us, so to speak. And that's beyond just African peoples or African descended peoples, to continue do this message. So we have to do that. We also have to support our people, our lawyers who are going to be arguing these cases. We have to support them as best we can. And I'm not talking about money. Many of them are going to be coming from organizations that have the financial wherewithal. but we have to, support them in whatever way they need. And I think part of the support is, in the movements that I've been involved in, from prisoner rights, ACLU, to others, we always had a group on the outside that was moving the issue too, talking about it, supporting it. So I think we have to do both ways. I think we also have to, and we had a long talk about this in our preparatory meeting, I think we have to flip what they say back onto them. Fine, you want to talk about those who were enslaved and not use race, then we will say those who were enslaved. It's a longer statement, but those who were enslaved in the United States from blah, 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 those who Africans, I think we can say Africans, that were put on the ships, stolen from Africa and brought here and then enslaved. And those who are, because we are also, I know, and Cobra does, and I know others do, we are not just a reparations for people who can trace their descendancy to an enslaved African, because the injury that is caused is despite whether or not you're enslaved or not. We call it the legacies of slavery. And so those of us, like using Diallo for an example, we did that in Nkechi and our Legal Strategies Commission, if you can recall. They didn't stop and ask if Diallo was a descendant of an enslaved African when they shot him 42 times in the back. Or shot, I think it was in the back, but shot him 42 times. They didn't ask it. But the legacy says Black man, we'll call him African descendant now, walking down suspicious, I'm gonna shoot before I talk. Mm-hmm. That's the legacy of slavery. And so we have to be able to discuss it using their terminology, twisting it on them, but then also using ours.
Hey, Jeff?
I think those 2 points are really important. And I think that the benefit of something like HR 40 is that there'll be a commission to investigate, debate, research these very issues about what was just talked about. And I agree completely. You can call it, people who can trace their legacy back to their forefathers and foremothers being enslaved. But if there were people from Africa who came here in 1867, I guarantee you they got treated exactly the same way that the people who were enslaved got treated. That's not to say that, there aren't differences. And so there's some people that say, there should be one level of reparations for those who trace their history all the way back to their ancestors being enslaved. There should be a different set of construct, or a different set of standards for reparations for those who came after slavery. There should be a cutoff time for if you came after this date, you wouldn't be eligible. All of those things are things that can be discussed and debated. There is no perfect legislation for anything. And so don't let perfection be the thing that lets people say, oh, well, we can't go there, because there's never been perfect legislation. But as soon as you say the legacy of slavery, as soon as you say vestiges of slavery, you are talking about people who cannot necessarily trace their heritage back to their forefathers and foremothers being enslaved here. So I just think that that is one of the things that the record has to be. We can't just say that. There needs to be research that's done and put into the congressional record to support this bill. That's the way that a bill can withstand constitutional challenge. And let me be clear on this. Affirmative action, at least I believe, can be looked at differently, because the concept about affirmative action is you were Black and there is a history of racism against Black people, so we're going to give you this advantage in education. And it's unclear how this history of racism may have affected you or you or you. We're talking about kind of just vestiges here. With reparations, we're talking about a very distinct injury and a very traceable injury. And I think we can trace it in a different way than the affirmative action arguments. So this is where lawyers who are coming up have to listen to what Charles Hamilton Houston said. He's like, this ain't about being a genius. This is about being a technician, probing in the court to see how much freedom we can get before the system clamps down. And so there are some things Ketanji Brown Jackson said, but I think it's important that trying to build a definition that people think will meet the standard of the Supreme Court justices today is a very risky proposition.
Tell us
what
why.
makes
Why
you
is that
think
risky?
they're going to rule the same way? What makes you think Clarence Thomas is going to be consistent on this? Or Samuel Alito? Give me a break. These people might say, oh, this kind of definition might work. And then the case comes and they say, no, we thought about it. It doesn't work that way. So there is no guarantee that trying to meet a standard that we think may be there on an issue that is not directly related to reparations. It's closely related, I'm not denying that, but affirmative action and reparations are two different issues. And so trying to say that whatever standard they come up with, if we meet that, it will be okay, I just think it doesn't help. And so we've got to figure out a way to get a standard that will fairly describe the group of people that were harmed, because that's the whole point.
So, Jeff, I just want to continue along just a moment that thread with Ketanji, because I know at one point you shared with me 2 letters that she proffered as
well,
part
and I went and got the exact quote because I don't want to
Alright.
paraphrase what she said. This is during the arguments on the affirmative action case. She says to the people arguing against affirmative action, she says, I've got a problem, and here's the problem. 2 applicants to the University of North Carolina. The first applicant says, and I'm reading from the transcript, I'm from North Carolina. My family has been in this area for generations since before the Civil War, and I would like you to know that I will be the 5th generation to graduate from the University of North Carolina. I now have that opportunity to do that, and given my family background, it's important to me that I get to attend this university. I want to honor my family's legacy by going to this school. Second letter. I'm from North Carolina. My family has been in this area for generations since before the Civil War, but they were slaves and never had a chance to attend this venerable institution. As an African American, I now have that opportunity, and given my family background, it's important to me to attend this university. I want to honor my family legacy by going to this school. Now, as I understand, now she's asking the question to the lawyer. As I understand your no race conscious admissions rule, these 2 applicants would have a dramatically different opportunity to tell their family stories and to have them count. The first applicant would be able to have his family background considered and valued, while the second one wouldn't be able to, because his stories in many ways is bound up with his race and the race of his ancestors. So I want to know, based on how your rule would likely play out in that scenario, why excluding consideration of race in a situation in which the person is not saying that his race is something that's impacted him in a negative way, he just wants to have it honored, just like the other person wants to have their background honored. Is telling him no an equal protection violation? And the guy answers and says, yes. No to the person that brings up race, but the other person is absolutely fine. That is where it falls apart, because as we know, if you think about what I read from the first person, that clearly identifies him as a white person. The fact that he didn't write WHITE doesn't need to tell you that if he got 5 generations of people going to the University of North Carolina, that is a white kid. I'm sorry, it doesn't work out any other way. So the notion that we are not using race is in itself a fiction.
Wow.
And that's what the justice pointed out. And it's important to understand whatever decision comes out, There are going to be dissenting opinions, and today's dissent is often tomorrow's majority opinion.
Adjoa?
Yeah, I think though that the in addition to all the good points that are being made, I think the fundamental question, as I understand it, correct me, organizers, if I'm wrong, is how race, and I asked Nkechi about this before, when she invited me, weaponization, how race is being used as a weapon against the just claims, I won't say ours even, the just claims for reparations. And it's being used as a weapon, not just in the courts. I mean, we can focus on the courts, but the courts are a reflection of the conservative attack upon us, Black people, African descended people, whatever you go by, an attack upon us by, many communities, and we can focus on Florida because it's maybe the most known, where they want to change history. They want to take mention of race out of the classroom. They have decided that certain texts by well-known authors, skilled authors, not skilled authors, but very credentialed authors, cannot be taught in the schools. The weaponization is an attack upon not only our history, but their history. And so, and it is done, to me, I know I may not be the only one, but I take ownership. It is being done to protect the lie of white superiority. And it's being done to I want to say whitewashing, I know, their own history. It's like, I am supposed to be, I'm white, okay? Just, assume, right? I'm white. I am supposed to be all the positives behind that word, right? Behind that label. But this history that my people led and that I support contradicts the lie I've been telling for centuries. So I need to protect me. I need to protect my status that was built on a lie. And I've been living a lie. And that's what disturbs me when I see all these Black graduates from not just Morehouse, where the guy gave everybody that year, paid all their bills, not just top schools in the Black community, but top schools in the white community. Lord, some schools not top, right? So let's not be biased against it's ordinary community colleges or ordinary colleges that may not be, in quotes, highly ranked, however they do that. It defeats the lie. The genius of Black people defies that lie. And it's like Community Healing Network says, it's a lie, defy the lie. And we've been doing that, and they can't stand it. See, as long as they could say we were good at football, or we were good at basketball, or we were good at dancing, or we were good at singing, it was okay. But when you start seeing Black folk challenging them in the sciences, not challenging them, challenging the lie. You see, it's not challenging them, it's challenging the lie. So for me, the weaponization on both ends has been to deny our humanity, putting us at the bottom of the racial hierarchy. And on this end, is to deny their horror, their participation in the horror that is racial oppression. So I strongly say again, we fight it by exposing it, by doing what Nkechi and Jam are doing on this webinar, but by spreading it even further, writing things, speaking it. We don't know the result. My spirituality says you don't worry about the result. You do the right thing, or what your heart has led you to do that you believe is the right thing.
So, Adjoa, I think this brings us to the second part of the discussion, weaponization of race and how to combat it. Jeff, you have any views with respect to, in addition to everything that Adjoa has so eloquently laid out, just how do we combat this lie?
Well, one of the things that I think is that open discussion of these issues and public discussion of these issues is absolutely critical. And I see a lot of discussion where people say, well, if you think people who can't trace their history back to enslavement should get reparations, you're a this or a that. Or if you think people who can't get trace their history back to slavery shouldn't get reparations, or should, and it's like you're a this and you're that. That's completely unhelpful. There are points on either side. That's the beauty of HR 40. There is a commission where this can be discussed, and who are those who think that eligibility requirements should be this, then we can have that discussion and it can be well researched and well presented. And those who think eligibility requirements should be different, then they can present that information, which can be well researched and discussed. And we can come to the best possible solution that we can come to. And there are people that say, oh, immigrants came here by choice. And I suppose everyone who immigrated to America came here by choice. I don't know how that makes a difference. Are you saying they came here so they deserved what they got?
Yeah, I think that's what
they
came
here by choice.
They deserve
and that's what I'm saying. I'm not saying that everyone is treated the same, but when you say vestiges of slavery, this is just the way we're talking about. This is the English language. The second you start talking about anything after 1865, the vestiges of slavery applied to people who were never enslaved. And I'm sorry, but that is just a historical fact. Now, we may decide in the debate about it and the discussion about it, well, even though that's true, that group of people shouldn't get reparations or should get some other kind of redress. That may be a decision people come to. But if you're trying to say that the experience in terms of the vestiges of slavery were different, I'm sorry, the facts just don't deny it. And in terms of Amadou Diallo, to kind of make my point, he was shot 41 times, and several of those shots entered through the soles of his feet, which means he was already on the ground and they were still shooting. And that's because the vestiges of slavery said to those police officers, this is a Black dude and his life is not worth it.
Mm-hmm. I'm about to put in the chat. Let me just put this in the chat because Lisa Holder is still on the dais with the Reparation California Task Force. It doesn't end until 5 o'clock Pacific time, which is 8 o'clock our time. This is something that she wrote, and I told her I would be sure that I would share it with the group. She's still going to try to hop on after the, we're probably while we're doing Q&A if she's able to, but that's what I just put in the chat. It's a article that she wrote regarding the California Reparation Task Force recommendations. Adjoa, I think you were about to converse.
Yeah, I guess to be quite honest, I'm a little distracted by the chat. Mm-hmm. And I'm distracted by it, and I'm a strong ACLUer sometimes, and I believe in the right of people to say what they want. But my distraction is that there is, on the chat, there's this argument around immigrants and descendants and, you know, the latest very long chat thing is about Jews and all of that. And so I understand the intellectual and practical, perhaps, focus of many people on this topic. But for me, and again, I like to take ownership. For me, the question that is raised, and some people say they don't see what this has to do with reparations, when we've been talking about reparations connected to all of this discussion since the beginning. I feel like we distract ourselves. And I'm gonna say it. And some of the people in the chat or in the group are gonna be very upset with me. We distract ourselves because we make arguments about who should get and who should not get when the crime against African peoples is broad. It goes, as we have said, and you don't have to agree, but the injury from the enslavement of African peoples and the vestiges of African people go beyond just those who are descended from those enslaved. Now, you can argue all day long that they have a separate claim. You can argue all day long that that's, you know, they shouldn't be included. But you also have to at least see, maybe you don't, maybe that's the wrong way to say it, but my view is that the injury continued after slavery and it got defocused on people who were not enslaved because the injury was tied to your, as someone put in the chat, phenotype. You see, one of the things I shared on our preparatory call, Plessy v. Ferguson, Plessy had to say, I am a Black man, because he looked white. So he was attempting to prove a point and say, no, you ain't putting me in the white car. I'm a Black man. And so he was in the segregated car so they could litigate the case. And he was a Black man. I'm not trying to say he wasn't. But if we look at phenotype, there are people you don't know who the hell they are, except your assumption. You know who I am. I'm of African descent because of my coloration. But if I were much lighter and didn't wear my hair like this, straightened it, you might not know. So I'm doing a little long-winded and I got myself distracted a little bit. So for me, it is, and it is almost insulting that we spend so much time fighting against ourselves. That's what is happening in this chat even. And so that's why I'm distracted, because I didn't know how to bring it up. Because I didn't want to mess up Jam and Nkechi's webinar, but it's distracting. It's not only distracting, it's insulting.
So thank you for that, Adjoa. And the strong request was made for people to put any Q&A that they have in the Q&A and not in the chat. I am not looking at the chat. I'm looking at the Q&A. So actually it's about time, Jam, and I know you're going to group some things together because a number of the comments were very similar. So Jam, can you go on and let's just start this Q&A as we are continuing our discussion. Thank you.
I wanted to ask my own question real quick before we go in there. So we talked about race and reparations, and I really wanted to know, and this is one of the questions that Nkechi brought up, is it reparations if we can't address race? So right now, one of the topics is Providence, Rhode Island, and the $10 million reparation fund that anyone can apply to. So like a white person could apply to it, but they have given money out in the form of grants and funds to programs, including majority Black led programs. would you all consider that a form of reparative justice? Why or why not? Or is it somewhere in between?
Can you repeat that last part? Is it?
Would you consider the program in Providence as a form of reparatory justice? Why or why not? Or is it somewhere in between?
I was on a program, Northeastern University, what is it, Center for Civil Rights Restoration Department, that's not how you call it, had a program in which they had one of the lawyers from the Providence program who helped design it, I think, Black lawyer on it. I believe he was a lawyer. As he described it, and I think, Jam, you described it accurately too. As he described it, it is not a targeted reparations program. And by that, I mean, it's not targeted just to those people who were injured by white superiority or white supremacist attacks upon people of color. I think, at least for me, it is not the kind of program I would endorse as a reparations program for African descendants. It's much like I was on the ABA Council on people of color or something like that. And I argued against it because it lumps even all people of color together, and our injuries are different. I'm still injured, I'm not denying they're injured. So for me, it's not the kind of reparations program I think really meets the injuries done to African descended people, not only in Rhode Island, but if it's a similar, if they do the same thing, and I've heard people saying they're going to do the same thing, other places. So, you know, but the people in those communities, you know, they're getting what they get.
Yeah, I think
I think whether it's a reparations, whether it's called reparations or not, is not a significant issue. It's important, but it's not that significant because there is no one program that's going to repair the harm that's been done. So we're talking local programs, state programs, nationally with HR 40. There is no one thing. So if there is a city somewhere that is focusing some money and a significant part of it is going to our community, I'm good with that. We don't have to call it reparations, but that doesn't mean it's not good legislation.
Yeah, like Jam, just before you go to Q&A, I guess my whole thing is, and I've been struggling with this for a while, the distinction, or should there be a distinction? I think there should be, but if so, what? Is there a bright line between what is reparations, reparatory justice, and ordinary public policy, which should accrue to the benefit of everyone, anyone, everywhere? I don't know, Adjoa, it looked like you had a brainstorm on that one.
I think that as I understood the gentleman when he was laying it out, and Jam did it accurately, they are attempting, to address injuries caused by the state, Rhode Island, against primarily people of color. But they open it up to, as Jam said, to whites who also, if they can't, they have a right to try and say they fall within that category. But everybody has to have, as I understand it, and I may be wrong, they can't just say, well, I'm Native American, or I'm Black, or I'm Latino, give me some money. They are much like the, what is that? Is that Evanston that has a thing for housing, I believe?
Yeah, Evanston,
Is that Evanston?
Illinois. Yes.
So it's much like that. It's targeted to certain areas of injury. And the priority, as he explained it, were Native Americans, Blacks, and maybe Latinx, I think, but that, you know, whites could apply. So I agree with what Jeff is saying, but it is not the kind of reparative justice program we've been talking about since even before 87, when NCOBRA was formed. So that's what I think all of us, at least for me, and Nkechi has said, it gives you pause to really think about it and that. But I agree with Jeff, if it's gonna provide some relief and or repair, then, you know, let's focus on that, I think.
You're muted.
We're going to deal with some Q&A. Thank you, Jam. Going and let's go on and start the Q&A with the audience.
All right, so I'm gonna bundle up some of these because some of them are some of the questions are very similar. And the first two that I'll bundle, Adjoa, you kind of were getting into this because this is some of the discussion that was going on in the chat. So what are healthy and non-divisive ways we can address and acknowledge the degrees of harm suffered among Black people in the United States? And are there ways that we can acknowledge that descendants of slaves may have been harmed the most while also acknowledging the harm suffered by Black people who may not fall into that category? And I'm bundling that with another question where a person asked, is someone who immigrated to the United States from Africa 3 years ago qualified for reparations for slavery and Jim Crow?
I think this is the place where, in my view, HR 40 is brilliant, because these things will have to be discussed in the open. And, you know, off the top of my head, somebody that came 3 years ago, I'm not so sure. How about somebody that came 80 years ago? And when we say, you know, people are right, people who immigrated here after slavery knew that America had slavery until 1865. Was America being broadcast as an absolutely racist country? Was that the view around the world? And just to stop to think about it, are we essentially saying we're blaming the victim? You came here, so you deserve what you got. You're somehow not a victim because you came here knowing that other people had been victimized. So these are things that I just think should be discussed in the open. And that's where I think we will get to the best resolution of them. And so I don't have an answer to the question. What I have is, you don't draft a piece of legislation that decides these things in advance, because that cuts off the ability of the people who came here after slavery. They should have a chance to come here and say, this is why we should be included in this reparations bill. This is how the vestiges of slavery affected my family, even if we weren't enslaved. And other people should be able to say, we understand that, but this is how it's different. So I think having a commission to decide this will get us to the best possible solution. Last thing I want to say is, even if you believe that the reparations net should be broader, should include people who came here after slavery, of African descent, even if you believe that, there is nothing that says that every single person in America who fits into that category gets reparatory justice of the same kind. There are individual families who can trace significant, specific losses, and those families, you know, may have reparatory claims that are different from everybody else. So a category for people who trace their ancestry back to enslaved people here, maybe they're treated differently than people who came after slavery. And maybe the things that they are eligible for are different than the things that somebody else is eligible for. All of these things can be discussed. And I'm not saying people of color, you know, I'm very comfortable saying people of African descent, because that's the way it has worked in this country. And so let's look at that. And you know, if there is a difference of opinion, and there clearly is, the best way to deal with it is to discuss it honestly and openly and in public, so everybody hears what everybody has to say. And then hopefully the best possible resolution will come from that discussion.
The present co-chair of NCOBRA, will put something in the chat in response that I totally agree with. In fact, it's where I was going to go, and then I saw he put something in the chat along these lines. Reparations, and this is something Dorothy Benton Lewis started talking about, the late Dorothy Benton Lewis. She's now no longer with us. Many years ago in our Reparations Legal Strategies Commission that I chaired for NCOBRA. Reparations is more than a check. And the UN has 5 categories, and I'm going to mess up, not name them all, but compensation, which is I think what people most focus on, is only one. So if we look at the 5 areas, it's restitution, compensation, strategies for non-repetition.
Restitution.
I said restitution.
Oh.
Well, yeah, rehabilitation. Yeah, somebody put rehabilitation. So if we look at the forms reparations takes, you can delineate, and I agree with Jeff, that in discussions, if we're talking about HR 40, who would get compensation versus who would, get any of the other forms. But clearly, I mean, when we talked about it in NCOBRA Legal Strategy Commission, we were thinking also more so about developing like criminal punishment system, for example, is one major area that has targeted Black people, that is a vestige of slavery. Police who were what did they call those? The slave catchers. That whole process was turned from so-called slave catchers to the police. This is direct lineage. As my colleague and friend who is now, we have to keep holding him in our prayers, Charles Ogletree would say, it was an unbroken chain from slavery to the current criminal legal system. So in that, you can do a mixture of compensation for those who were targeted by it, but you could also do a change in that system itself as a form of reparations. And that impacts more than just the people who are directly injured. It focuses on those who are within the group of injured people. I'm just using that as one example. You can do that with education. You can do that with health. You can do that. What's our other categories? Peoplehood, nationhood. We talked about that. About a young NCOBRA person 2 or 3 years ago said the current violation of peoplehood is voter suppression, suppressing our vote. So when you look at the 5 categories that the UN has endorsed for forms reparations should take, it's more than just a check, like Dorothy said.
Right.
And like we've been saying. So I think that that's how you can get at the broader group, but also the narrow group as well.
Dan, what else we have there in the chat?
All right, I'm bundling again because we have a lot. I agree with our distinguished panel about accurately describing the people harmed. Should we define Black as it was defined in Plessy versus Ferguson? And then another person asked, could we use the 3/5 clause as part or the basis for our claim?
That's interesting.
Let me say just a little bit about the 3/5 clause, because obviously, I shouldn't say obviously, one could say that the 13th Amendment and the 14th Amendment would overrule the 3/5 clause or make the 3/5 clause invalid. But it's very interesting that they were very clear about who would be counted as 3/5 of a person, because this was what was going to give the South not control of, but a major impact on the Electoral College. In the letters that were written during the Constitutional Convention, I think it was Patrick Henry, the guy, give me liberty or give me death. He said there are 236,000 Blacks in Virginia and few or none in the northern states. He was talking about what happens if we decided don't want to be enslaved anymore. He was talking about guns, but 3/5 of 236,000 is a huge number of people to add to the population, which decides how many Congress people you get and how many votes in the Electoral College. And if you ever wonder if that was an impact, 9 of the first 12 presidents of the United States came from the South, and 7 of the 9 came from Virginia. The Electoral College did exactly what it was supposed to do. So I think that's just, for me, the Electoral College is part of the record that needs to be built when you are talking about the institution of slavery in the United States before you ever even get to the vestiges. These are the things that the 3/5 thing wasn't just to dehumanize us. It was to protect slavery against the electoral process in case anybody started deciding we don't want to have slaves anymore. So I think that is the kind of thing that would be critical to be taken into account by any organization that is thinking about reparations, on a global level, and trying to have the history to justify it, so that when you go to court later, you can say, these are the facts that we are pointing to that justify the legislation we're defending.
Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Sure. Let me scroll back up. But essentially, there was a question about can we define Blackness as it was defined in Plessy versus Ferguson? And can the 3/5 clause be used as a part of or the basis of a part of our claim?
Mm-hmm. I don't remember how it was defined in Plessy, and I don't know if anyone on the panel does.
I don't remember the exact quote.
I don't recall that. My view is that the 3/5 clause is just another piece of evidence to support reparations. That's my view on it. That yes, it can be used as an example of the continual from early on. I mean, the dismissiveness of who we were as a people and giving us, this 3/5 clause kind of thing. So yes, I would say it could be used as a part of evidence. I want to make a point, if I could, and I'm sorry if this is not right, but I'm going to do it. There's a person that took personally the discussion about reparations is more than a check. It is not just people who support lineage-based that answer was addressed to. When we were talking in COBRA, I'm sorry, NCBO and COBRA, this is with people who did not articulate a lineage-based view. We were just articulating that if we're going to get full reparations, it is more than a check. So that wasn't addressed to people who embrace lineage-based. That was addressed to generally people, some people out here who have heard reparations, focus on it being a check, either in support of it or as opposed to it. It has nothing to do with an expression towards anybody who is endorsing or supports a lineage base. So let me make that record real clear. Because when we were meeting back in, when was that, Nkechi?
I remember back in the
90 and 1991, we had arguments and
oh yeah,
healthy
no one was talking about immigrants back then. Nobody was talking about
healthy debates about we don't just a check ain't gonna just fix it. There was
when we first came together. Everyone wasn't at one mind when we first came together within COBRA with HR 40. But one of the things we did do, we discussed our issues in a respectful manner. We didn't make any personal attacks on, anyone. We discussed and debated the issues that were there, and we respected each other as people and as part of family. Okay, that's not what I see today. So it's hard to even get into part of the discussion when you're being attacked on a personal basis. I just had to say that because we may not be too far away in views. We just don't know, because we can't talk to each other civilly. We can't put civil things, in the chat. We can't be in a statewide forum in a chat and be respectful. I mean, we have devolved, and that's part of the harm. That's part of the injury. That's part of the trauma that white supremacy has done to us, to tear at each other, where we need to be united and unified. We might not agree with everything, okay, but we can agree to disagree in a civil and respectful manner. What is that term called? Unity, but we should have unity even if we don't have uniformity. You know what I'm saying? So anyway, go on and keep going, Jam. I didn't want to take us away from the Q&A.
No problem. So here are two questions that are also kind of similar. Mama Fatima asked if the race and identity issue could be simplified by simultaneously identifying African/African descendants or Black people in the US as a victimized cultural group as defined by the Geneva Convention's international human rights laws. And then Cam Howard asked, in addition to the two areas of action raised, what are the panelists' thoughts about an ethnicity claim to get around the race claim? I think that's where a lot of anti-immigrant rhetoric rises. Although this is not new, can it be used to overcome civil and legal challenges? So those are kind of similar. The first one is about the victimized cultural group as defined by Geneva Convention. The second one more so about ethnicity. So what are you all's thoughts on those?
Before you do that, did they mean Geneva Convention or the Genocide Convention? The Geneva Convention deals with prisoners of war. The Genocide Convention deals with genocide against peoples. I'm not quite sure which of the international conventions.
Just
I just wanted to point out
the one that you think, Nkechi.
Well, no, I was letting y'all go on. And the ethnicity. Why don't you start with the ethnicity one?
Okay, I think that's where I was going with saying we're African and African descendant. That's nationality. That's not necessary. That's not really ethnicity, I don't guess. I'm not sure. But I do think that that's one way of going. Someone put in the chat, and I think I agree with them, whatever we do, they're going to try and combat it, right?
Right.
That's somebody put that in the chat, and I wholeheartedly agree with that. We can call ourselves the green people, and they would say, oh, no, you can't do that. We can call ourselves whatever. But the point is to clearly, for me at least, it's especially since, and I've shared that and others have shared their view on it, since it was a social construction, why even go there? Why not just stay with African descendant? That's my view. Others may disagree, but we fight and we keep combating it in any form that they bring. And I do think having some, what do you call them, brain trusts or whatever, discussions about how we do this is important. But let's be clear, we have struggled with our identity based on what they called us since we've been here. Nigger, colored, Negro. Then my friend Ramona and Jesse Jackson put it out, but said, what about African American? So we've been, what we call ourselves has been kind of a long, arduous
New African.
Yeah, I'm sorry, sis. I'm sorry, New African. That she introduced me to that back in the early 80s. But we've been struggling. We've been struggling. Who are we? And part of that, who are we, is another injury. That's why we call it in Nkopa, peoplehood, nationhood.
Right.
Right? Because that's part of the injury. So I think in arguing then when they say you can't use race and you can't use African and all that, is you are defining us for us. You can't do that.
So with respect to the Genocide Convention, I think what they're referring to, and I'm looking at the statute, I used to be able to do it by heart, but in the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part. Now, this is the part that I think they want to do. A national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. And then it goes through the various things. That's not just killing everyone, it's killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting upon the group conditions of life calculated to bring about their destruction in whole or in part, taking measures to prevent births within the group, and transferring children from one group to another. That's the definition of genocide, which is codified in US law, in the US code. But again, what they said was the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. I think that might be what the questioner was.
So I think there again, so in relationship to that, what you're talking about is evidence of a justification for reparations that goes beyond 1865. Because everything you just said can be documented. And you said, I think the key part of the phrase is, and you'll have to correct me, I'm paraphrasing, but you don't have to destroy the entire group. You can just destroy in whole or in part.
Or in part.
Listen to or remember what Richard Nixon's administration admitted, what his cabinet members admitted. We knew we couldn't make it against the law to be Black or against the Vietnam War. But by criminalizing the marijuana and heroin and associating the hippies with marijuana and the Blacks with heroin, we could break into their communities, disrupt their meetings, arrest their leaders,
night after night on the evening news.
Night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. So that is the kind of, and that is one thing. I know I've said it a couple of times, but I feel like there is so many times that legislation has been struck down. And when you look at the record that's supposed to support that legislation, the record is inadequate. And so we can't go into this, and I'm talking specifically about HR 40. We can't go into this thinking, well, there's no question about whether reparations are deserved. We've got to prove this case from the ground up, both for what happened during slavery and for what happened after 1865. And so that statutory definition of genocide is the perfect kind of evidence. And for each of those examples, I would want to put 10 to 20 things in the record showing this meets this example. Now, what's the next one? Here's 10 to 20 pieces of evidence. What's the next one? 10 to 20. That is how you build a legislative record that will stand up on appeal.
Jan, we just have a few minutes left. And before you go to, I think, let's see, we can have a concluding Q&A question. I'm just telling you what I'm putting in the chat because that looks like Lisa Holder was not able to join. I have included a report that her organization, Equal Justice Society, did called Supreme Court Could Strike Blow to Affirmative Action. And it's a report, a project of the Take Back the Court in the Equal Justice Society. So I just have that in there, as well as the earlier article that she wrote as part of her contribution to this discussion. Go on, Jam.
Sure. So we only have 3 minutes left. I'm gonna ask one final question that I think kind of gets us back into specifically about race. It's another question from Cam, and everyone, please forgive us if we couldn't get to your question, but I promise I'm documenting your questions for future conversations because this is going to be an ongoing series. So if your question wasn't particular to this discussion, it's being saved for something else and we will address it. Okay, so this question is, Can there be a crime-based claim, the redress for the impact of crimes, the victims of those crimes, slavery, apartheid, et cetera, can make the just claim for reparations and not base it on race? Can that happen? Or what are thoughts on describing a claim as crime-based?
I will just say very quickly that the fear that I have is that the current Supreme Court will take anything that we use and say, this is just a proxy for race.
Mhm.
When you say crime, you really mean race. When you say this, you really mean race. And they have suggested in the questioning in the affirmative action cases, there was something about, the Freedmen's Bureau after the Civil War, and would that be okay? And a lot of people have said, well, see, they're gonna allow something that's based like that. But I just think that you have to have a confidence in the integrity of the justices on the Supreme Court on this issue. And quite frankly, I don't have that confidence. So what I'm concerned with more is about how can we most accurately describe it so that factually we can defend whatever it is that we decide to call the group that's eligible.
I think if I'm answering the question correctly, understanding the question, I think that we do our very best to make our case utilizing the language that we think is the best. If they say we can't say Black, then we say something else. If we're before the Supreme Court, we're in court. But the fight for reparations is not the court's fight necessarily right now. It is the people's fight. And so we have to continue in the organizations in Cobra, many others who are fighting for reparations, others that may not be totally devoted to reparations, but also support reparations. We have to continue to make our case. The legislation, as I understand it, and Jeff and Nkechi can correct me wrong, was amended by John Conyers in 2017, I believe. So that technically we don't have to prove we deserve reparations. We have to prove what form. Now, that doesn't mean, as a good advocate, whether you're a lawyer or what, that you don't come in with your data, because you know they're going to take you off point and you're going to have your data. But the technical way is what form. And so I think we can do that.
So any final thoughts on race and reparations?
Well, I can just start if you don't mind, Jeff.
No, please.
Those who know me know I have been an advocate for reparations since the early 1980s when I saw the poster. I tell the story all the time because I'm walking back to my office at the Department of Justice in Anro, African National Reparations Organization, had put up this big old poster with the typical picture of Uncle Sam pointing out, saying, Black folks, Uncle Sam owes you, and I forget how many trillions, but they had. And I'm walking back to my house and I said, yes. And that's when I became a part of the reparations movement. Before I met Nkechi, I don't think I'd met you yet, Nkechi. And then Nkechi was my mentor in reparations, as I was in part one of her legal mentors. This is a question to me of fundamental justice. And that's why I get somewhat irritated about when I see all the divisiveness, as opposed to someone said in the chat, let's sit down and talk about our differences. There's no 100% one way or the other. And I think it undermines our work. But that being said, we are owed reparations, however we define we, and I differ, and some of us differ with each other on that definition, but it is a question of fundamental justice. And I continue to the day I take my last breath to support our demand for reparations.
Thank you, Adjoa. And Jeff, if you can give your concluding remarks, and I hope you will also say something about just how the Who We Are project is helping to deal with that second part of how to combat this whole weaponization of race.
The whole purpose of the Who We Are project is to make the truth about America's history of anti-Black racism endemic. It is clear when you look at almost 37 states that have either passed or are considering laws that would restrict what can be taught about our history. If anybody has any question about how important understanding the past is, all you got to do is look at how hard some people are trying to erase it, because they know if they erase it, they can do some shit and claim that it's new when it's really decades old, if not centuries old. So I think a critical part of, recognizing that the law has been changed, I think a critical part of any reparations operation or any reparations movement has to be a very public discussion of what the harms are, who the harmed community is, and how those harms are going to be addressed. Last thing I would say is that I think it is important. It's been said a couple of times, reparations are more than just a check. And there's nobody on this call who will say that what was done to our community can be repaid with a check. There is not a check that is big enough to pay for that. Part of the harm is the harm to our community. And one of the things that I hope is addressed is a reparatory stance towards our community at large. And that's the beauty of a bill, is that there isn't any one form that has to be the only form. So I hope that with the brilliance of people who are working on this issue and committed to it, that we can actually get something so that we can start talking about exactly how is it going to be set up, as opposed to are we going to be able to get to that point.
Okay, so before I thank everyone, Jam, did you have a concluding remark you want to make?
None. I'm just so thankful for Jeffrey and Adjoa and all of the information that you shared with us today. This has been a really lively discussion, and I can tell from the chat and from the interaction, this is something that was needed for a very long time, and we can continue to have this ongoing conversation. Thank you. Yes,
and I agree. And Jeff, you as a constitutional law scholar, Adjoa, you as a human rights attorney, Jam, you as a cultural anthropologist, and our sister Lisa Holder in absentia, Commissioner on the California Reparations Task Force. Thank you so very much for your contributions to this first in the series of Reparation Information Thought Series. We have two more in this particular series coming up on April the 27th. We're going to talk about comprehensive reparations, a blueprint for reparatory justice in the United States. And on May 25th, the theme will be lineage, burden of proof, divisive, difficult, and under-inclusive. So you will be receiving the login for those as well as the speakers. So again, thank you for everyone. I think at our height, we had over 90 participants in this webinar. We appreciate everyone. And as Jam said, we are keeping the information, the chat, the Q&A, and everyone's comments will be gotten to and addressed. This is Nkechi Taifa, Director of the Reparation Education Project, who is co-hosting this series along with Jessica and Mitchell Aiwuyor, the National Black Cultural Information Trust. Thank you so very much.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Good night.